So this is going to be the second rowing condition, which is going to be the aerobic training. And we're going to change things up slightly in terms of the variables. So with the anaerobic hard training, we made sure the last meal and bolus insulin was at least 3 hours before. So the only insulin circulating was going to be my basal insulin. So there was obviously no insulin adjustments to be made on that particular point. But this time it's quite common that somebody will be eating quite close to the time when they're exercising. So we need to think about insulin dose reductions for the exercise, for the meal before the exercise. So with the aerobic training, generally as a rule, if the exercise is going to be half an hour or more, this is going to be 40 minutes, that you're looking at about a 50% reduction of the insulin that you would normally give for that meal. And the key point here is you only want to do that reduction if the exercise is going to be within 90 minutes. So you can see by this chart here that how insulin works, it peaks after about an hour, 90 minutes, and then starts dropping off. So you only want to reduce the insulin if you're exercising within the peak of the insulin. If you reduce the insulin and then exercise, say 2 or 3 hours after, you're going to go really high. The glucose level is going to go very high. Now, my personal preference is I still think 90 minutes is on the far end, because if you reduce your insulin dose by half, in 90 minutes time, your glucose level is going to go quite high. So in this instance, I'm going to eat, give half the insulin dose, but exercise about 45 minutes later. So we should see a rise in the glucose level because there's not enough insulin to cover it. But then during the exercise, it should balance out quite nicely. Now, if it doesn't balance out quite nicely and I should have done more of a reduction, we've got a plan here depending on what the glucose level is and what the trend arrow is on the CGM. We'll be able to give supplementary carbohydrates in the form of dextrose during the exercise to make sure that that is maintained. So we'll check before, 20 minutes during, and then at the end of the 40 minutes. So the plan here now is to have 60 grams of carbohydrate. You hopefully can see on the back of there, each one of these bars is 15 grams carbohydrate each. It's 15 grams each, which is 60 grams of carbohydrate. My glucose level now. On the continuous glucose monitor, it says 8 and steady. On the finger pricker, it says 7.1 and steady. As I said before, as long as it's within 15% of the finger prick, which 8 is within 15% of 7, that's absolutely acceptable. That's the level of accuracy within 1.5 that you're going to achieve. It's important to know that they'll never be exactly the same, and if you're expecting that, you'll be disappointed. So because I want my glucose level to be between 7 and 10 when I start, I don't want to add any extra insulin on as a correction because it's already at 7 or 8, which is great. So I just want to give the insulin for the 60 grams carbs. Now my insulin to carbohydrate ratio is 1 unit of insulin for every 20 grams. So you do 60 grams of carbs divided by 20 would normally be 3 units of insulin. But I only want to give 50% of that, so there's not too much circulating insulin. So I'm going to give 1.5 units. You should be able to see that that says 1.5 units. Press Act. And that's now delivering that 1.5 units into my cannula site. I'll wait 15 minutes, I'll eat the food, and then after 45 minutes since the insulin's gone in, I'm going to start to row. Now the difference with this row compared to the previous one, on the previous one I was trying to get my heart rate into the 90, 95%, even 100% maximum heart rate. I got it up to 171 with 180 being my max. But with aerobic training, you're looking at somewhere between 65 and 80% of your maximum heart rate. So for me, that's going to be about 125 to 140. I'm going to try and sit at about 130 beats per minute, which on that Borg scale of perceived exertion is probably going to be somewhere around 12 or 13, a pace that I could maintain for a long time, 2, 3, 4 hours, should I so choose. What we would normally expect is, because I've only given half the insulin dose, there's not going to be enough insulin for the food. So the glucose will rise, but once I start exercising, the blood flow to my muscles is going to be faster. The insulin absorption is going to be faster, so it will make the insulin work more effectively. And also when you start to exercise, you also get an activation of what's called the AMPK pathway, which is almost like a side door to the cell that opens up, that translocates the glucose transporter 4 proteins to the cell surface and sucks more in. So we're going to have insulin working more effectively, sucking more glucose in, we're going to have a side door to the cells opening by this AMPK pathway, sucking more glucose in. So the fact that I've only given half the insulin, it should hopefully balance out. But as I said, if too much glucose is being sucked out of the blood into the muscles, we're going to every 20 minutes, well, before we start, we're going to check and give supplementary carbohydrate if required. And then at 20 minutes, we'll do the same. Because as you all know in clinical practice, people with type 1 diabetes, you will start with a plan that you think is going to work well, but you need to have an adaptable strategy during the exercise because the glucose never lies. What if the glucose is going down? You need more carbs. If the glucose is going higher, potentially you might need a bit more insulin. So you can start with a plan, but you really need some adaptability during that plan. So I shall eat my 4 bars shortly, and then we'll get on the rower and we'll do 40 minutes. So just about 5 minutes away from starting the activity. So I've reduced the insulin dose by half. And the first thing we need to do is check the glucose before starting and see whether obviously that reduction's worked or if my glucose level is below 7 and requires some supplementary carbohydrate. So at the moment, we've got the Dexcom is reading 8.3. The Super Sapiens is reading 164 milligrams per deciliter. And to get a millimoles per litre reading, you just divide that by 18. So 164 divided by 18 is 9.1. So we've got 9.1 and 8.3. We'll see what the finger prick is and we'll see what the lactate is also. So 9.2 on the glucose, so they're both, the Sapiens at 9.1 and the Dexcom at 8.3 are both within 15% and trending across. You can see from here, between 7 and 10 with the arrow trending across, no supplementary carbohydrates required for the first 20 minutes. But what we will do is check the glucose 20 minutes in. It may have dropped, it may not, we'll be able to see. The lactate is at 2.8. So we're back almost towards baseline. So obviously the recovery from there, from the previous one has been done. It'd be interesting to see what the lactate gets to during this me rowing at 130 beats per minute, about 70-75% max heart rate. Normally you'd probably expect to see maybe about a 5 or 6 millimolar lactate. For a person without diabetes, probably for me, we're going to be talking 7, 8s, 9s. And again, the reason being is that my circulating level of insulin is even higher. Now I've got that 1.5 units from before. That's really going to be driving carbohydrate metabolism, because when your insulin level is elevated in the blood, what that does is it stops your fat cells from releasing fat by turning down the activity of hormone-sensitive lipase, which is sat within the fat cells, which liberates fatty acids to be used for exercise. So again, when you've got type 1 diabetes, there is a huge bias towards using carbohydrate metabolism, which does have an impact in terms of energy utilization.
RPE?
Yeah, RPE is about 14. Next coming down saying 7 and trending down. So it'll be interesting to see. So the sheet here says 7, well, trending down. Seven and trending down should be 18 grams of glucose, which is 6 dextrose tablets.
So 5.6.
So 5.6, you can see the discrepancy there. When the glucose is trending down, that's at 7. 7 and down, it's 5.6 on the actual thing there. So I'm actually going, now we've got that information, I'm going to drop into there and see that I need 24 grams of glucose, which is 8 dextrose tablets.
Lactate's just coming up now. 5.3.
Lactate's 5.3, so that's not too high. And that shows the difference. Before on the real heavy anaerobic, it was up at 17, 18, which showed it was primarily carbohydrate metabolism. This certainly is carbohydrate metabolism, but I'm able to use that glucose through the full chain without necessarily turning it into lactate, hence lactate's only 5.3, and also I'll be using more fatty acids also. So this is trending in at 133 and going down, doing the maths off the top of my head, 133 divided by 18, I'll just do that on my meter. Is 7.3. So the Sapiens is 7.3 and trending down. The Dexcom is 7 and trending down, but the real finger prick is 5.6. So again, using my sheet, because it's trending down, I definitely need glucose. And in this case, I'm going to use the finger prick because I already know where it is. 24 grams of glucose, which is 8 dextrose tablets. I'm just going to get those. Hopefully this will be enough. So that's even with the insulin reduction I'm requiring the extra glucose. So the future plan will probably be 75% off instead of 50% off, because you would prefer not to have to supplement the glucose. But that's fine to have to do so if that's where you need to be adaptable and just not row without to do the insulin reduction and row for 40 minutes without checking halfway through. Otherwise I'd be in a whole heap of trouble. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 dextrose tablets. It's 24 grams of glucose. Not the most enjoyable thing to chew through. You could have it in a liquid form. So if you had Lucozade Original, that would be about 280 to 300 mils. If you had Lucozade Sport, that would be about 450 mils. So this is a 500 ml bottle. So the equivalent of 24 grams of glucose is roughly a full bottle.
It's 32.
32 in a full bottle. So yeah, just shy 400 mils you'd need. It's like 6 grams per 100 mils. So there's loads of different ways of getting it in. I prefer dextrose tablets just because they're portable. You can carry them anywhere, they're quite concentrated, but if you're on a rowing machine, you could obviously have the liquids. I've got my alarm. You see now it says 6 and down, so it's caught right up. So it's a good 5 minutes behind. So those 8 dextrose tablets are down. I've got my alarm set at 5.6, so I've no doubt that this will go off in the next 5 minutes or so. But because I've already swallowed those dextrose tablets, they won't have kicked in time, so I don't need to get too alarmed when it goes off at 5.6 because I've already made the treatment decision of having those. So I'm going to hop back on the rower now for the final 20 minutes. Still a chance I might go low, but that'll be to see. Was 140 and steady, so I kept it at that 75% max heart rate. So consistent heart rate at 140 all the way through, 75% max heart rate. Dexcom reading 4.9, the alarm went off at 5.5, but as I said, I'd already had the 24 grams of glucose, so I knew that wasn't going to be a problem. You just have to wait for that to kick in, so it seems like it's worked. The Sapiens, 100, that going down there, that's similar, that's about 5.2, 5.3, so again, very similar in terms of there. It'd be interesting to see what the finger prick is.
Are you feeling alright? Just wait for that one. 7.1.
7.1. So obviously that glucose that I'd had, that 24 grams, has really kicked in now. And again, when the glucose is moving rapidly, because I've just had 24 grams of pure glucose, the blood level is always going to rise quicker than the CGM. So what we'll see shortly is the CGM values catching up, and they'll be up in the 5s and 6s with the arrow trending up. So again, it's just to show when the glucose is moving rapidly during exercise, it can sometimes be worth thinking about doing a finger prick just to confirm where you are if you're concerned that it is going to be dropping along the way.
Lactate was 7.
Lactate is 7, so it's 5.8 before and 7. A rate of perceived exertion about 14. And as we described earlier, probably if I didn't have type 1 diabetes, this lactate would be sitting around 4 or 5. And that's because of the extra insulin that's on board is really driving carbohydrate metabolism at the cost of fatty acid metabolism. So that is one thing to consider for endurance athletes, is if there is a heavy reliance on carbohydrate, you're going to burn up your glycogen stores quicker, you're going to require more supplementary carbohydrate from the outside than a non-athlete, than a non-type 1. So again, thinking about elite athletes, that's something to factor into the mix when you're thinking about endurance exercise. There is going to be a higher need for exogenous carbohydrate supplementation, unless someone's following a very low carbohydrate diet, of course. So I guess, yeah, some things on the differences in terms of the physiology. On the first exercise episode that we did, we got the intensity up to 90-95% max heart rate. Let me just pause this and I'll do that again. Let's do my heading. So some of the differences in terms of physiology. The first exercise session that we did was short, sharp, intense, 3 minutes, all out, rate of perceived exertion 19, almost max heart rate, lactate up at 17, 20. That adrenaline release during that exercise is really pushing lots of glucose out from the liver, because the adrenaline releases the stored carbohydrate in there as glycogen and floods the bloodstream with glucose, and the muscle cells just can't take it up quick enough, hence the glucose rose. Whereas in this exercise, we're not pushing the intensity so high that the adrenaline release is a lot less. And what we do have is two things happening from the glucose uptake. We've got more blood flow to the muscles, which is delivering the insulin faster and recycling it more effectively at the blood. So we've got the insulin working more effectively. And then we've also got through the exercise, the AMPK pathway, which is a separate pathway which opens a side door to the muscle cells, which via bringing the glucose transporter force from the middle of the cell to the outside cell surface, dragging more glucose in. So we've got 2 lots of glucose being pulled in. And if you think that what's required for me to manage this exercise was half the insulin dose of the food that I would normally have, and still a supplementary 24 grams of extra carbohydrate during the exercise to keep it level during. So you can see the amount of glucose that's being pulled into the cell is significantly higher than before. And probably thinking about reviewing and improving plans, in an ideal world, I wouldn't have had to supplement with 24 grams of glucose during. I would have probably done a 75% reduction of my insulin before. So instead of giving 3 units as the full dose, I should have probably give something closer to 1 unit or 0.7 units. That way I could have probably managed the whole exercise without any supplementary carbohydrate. So now that's done, and we've done a good plan before, we've adapted during, you have to be conscious of what's going to happen to the glucose level afterwards. So what's going to happen now is my cells, my liver, and my muscle cells will have not exhausted, but used a large proportion of their stored glucose, and they're going to want to replenish that. So what's going to happen at my cell level is it's going to stay very sensitive to the insulin. This side door AMPK pathway is going to remain open for the next 7 hours or so. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have a meal afterwards. I cannot give the full insulin dose for my meal. And again, I'm going to have to give half of the insulin because otherwise I'm going to go low. But the virtue of doing exercise in the morning is because that insulin sensitivity period lasts 7 to 10 hours. And because I've done this exercise by 12 in the afternoon, I will be back to normal sensitivity before bed, so I don't have to worry too much about going low overnight. If I did this exercise at 6 or 7 p.m, I would definitely be thinking before bed, I need to reduce my background insulin on my pump by 20%, or have maybe a 20 or 30 gram carb snack with no insulin before bed if I was keeping my insulin at the same level. So sometimes for people, especially when they're starting out with exercise, it is good value to do the exercise in the morning because you don't want to expose people to going low overnight, which can be quite off-putting for exercise. So I'll get off here now and we'll go and have some food and show you the reduction of the insulin. So this is the meal after. As I described, my body's going to be very sensitive to insulin for the next 7 hours, and also that side door to my muscle cells via the AMPK pathway will be open for a little bit until my muscles and liver is replenished with the carbohydrate stores. So I'm going to need to reduce the insulin that I give for this meal. So this meal is going to be roughly 60 grams carbohydrate, 2 pittas with some vegetables and a few nuts. So dialing in, when I dial in my 60, I'll first need to do my glucose test. So as we said before, as we showed, the finger prick, the glucose was 7.1 after, and both continuous glucose monitors were a little bit behind. So it'll be interesting to see where that situation is now. We're about 5 or 10 minutes after. Okay, 6.6 on the finger prick. 5.4 now on the Dexcom, so that's caught up and it's trending, it's within 15%. And very similar, you've got about 6 on the Sapiens. So again, these devices are very accurate, but during exercise, 5 or 10 minutes behind. If it's moving rapidly and you're unsure, it can be worth doing a finger prick just so you don't get caught out. And certainly as I did, if you've got an alarm, you need to, for the exercise period, put the low alarm from 4 up to 5.5, just to give you that extra bit of safety, just in case it's dropping quickly, you're alerted a little bit sooner. Now, I don't want to add any correction in because around 6.6 is a good place to be. So if I dial in my 60 grams of carbohydrate, it's going to suggest 3 units. So I'm just going to give 1.5 units. That's been delivered. So what should happen is my sensitivity to insulin is almost doubled, hence why I only need to give half the insulin. And what we'll be able to check over the next 3 to 4 hours, what happens to this glucose trace over the next 3 to 4 hours. If this works ideally, it will probably go up a little bit to 7, 8, 9, and then come back down to 5 or 6. That will mean that the 50% reduction has worked perfectly. If I go too high, then next time a 50% reduction won't be enough. I'll just need to take a 25% off. Or if I go low, then next time I'll need to take 75% off afterwards. With type 1 diabetes, it will be great if everything stayed the same each time, but it doesn't necessarily. The ability to have a starting plan and then knowing how to adapt your plans is absolutely key, and that will change from person to person. So as a clinician, what works for one person won't necessarily work for the other, but as long as you understand the basic principles and have good starting plans, you'll be able to adapt those plans or teach them how to adapt those plans so that they can manage the different types of activity. So hopefully that's been useful to see the actual physiological and real life difference on a real hard all-out exercise, which makes your glucose level go up, and the value of doing a cool down to get rid of the lactate afterwards, and then the level of insulin reduction and supplementary carbohydrate required during an aerobic longer lasting session, 40 minutes, to maintain a glucose level, in this case between 4 and 10. So that's give you some starting ideas. We've been through how you can make a starting plan and how you can adapt it. So hopefully that's given you the confidence to use some of these things out with your patients.